Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to dive into a genuinely fascinating excerpt from a profound philosophical text called the Siddha Vedam, authored by Swami Sivananda ParamaHamsa. Now, if you've ever found ancient philosophy a bit dense or intimidating, you are in the exact right place. We're going to break down these vast, seemingly impenetrable concepts about the universe, the mind, and the ego using a brilliant, incredibly intuitive visual metaphor provided directly by the source text. We're talking about oceans, waves, foam, and bubbles. It's a journey from the very origins of the cosmos right down to the fragile little bubble of your own ego.
One source, many names.
So, let's set up the core philosophical dilemma here. We're dropping right into the middle of a profound conversation where the disciple asks a highly relatable question. Why is it that the mind came to be so called by different names like Vishnu, Shakti, Jalam, and Sukla? If you've ever studied Eastern philosophy, you've probably felt this exact same frustration. Why are there so many confusing names for what seems to be the exact same spiritual concept? How can the mind be a deity like Vishnu, an energy like Shakti, and elements like Jalam, which means water, or Sukla, meaning a brilliant effulgence?
The teacher responds with this incredibly grounding thesis. All refer to one and the same thing, viewed in different aspects. Despite the endless vocabulary, the sprawling pantheons of deities, and the complex classifications, it is all just one underlying reality. The names only change based on the specific function or phase we happen to be looking at. Think about it like looking at a piece of ice, a glass of water, and a cloud of steam. We use different words for them, but chemically, structurally, it's all exactly the same thing.
Moving on to Section 2, the cosmic evolution.
Let's see how this single source actually builds and transforms into the universe and ultimately into the human mind. The Siddha Vedam lays out a chronological sequence of cosmic evolution. We start at step 1 with Akshara, the imperishable, absolute, ultimate. This becomes Akasa, a vast, silent void. In step 2, this void is conceptualized as Sadasiva, which in step 3 is recognized as the real Brahma, the ultimate reality. But step 4 is where the magic really happens. When that absolute stillness begins to vibrate, it becomes Jiva. A silent void literally vibrates into a living, dynamic force. It's the transition from absolute nothingness to the spark of life.
Continuing that progression, we see how that living force, the Jiva, becomes Deha, essentially the embodiment or the form that's constantly being consumed by the fire of existence. Out of this fiery process, in step 2, comes an effulgence, a brilliance, called Sukla. And finally, in step 3, this Sukla becomes the mind. But it's not just a static mind. The text specifically says this mind flows and spreads like Jalam, or water. This spreading, flowing nature of the mind is what we call Vishnu, and it is the creative energy of Sakti. The mind literally originates all creation.
Section 3, the ocean of Maya.
Okay, I know that is a lot of dense Sanskrit and high-level metaphysics, but to keep us from getting lost, the text grounds us with this beautiful physical analogy. Imagine an enormous, deep, completely empty ocean bed. Just dry earth stretching for miles. You wouldn't call that an ocean, right? You just call it a deep, vacant place. Well, that physical void of a dry ocean bed perfectly mirrors the spiritual void of Akasa that we just learned about. Both are massive, fundamental vessels waiting to be filled. They have the potential for immense activity, but currently they are just empty space.
So what happens when we fill them? When you add water to that dry bed, it instantly transforms. It's no longer a vacant place. It is an ocean. Now, in our spiritual analogy, what fills the void of Akasa isn't water, but air, or Vayu. Just as adding water creates a physical ocean, adding the movement of Vayu transforms the static, spiritual void of Akasa into an active, incredibly dynamic reality.
And that brings us to a crucial definition. The ocean of Maya is simply the spiritual equivalent of an ocean in motion. Maya is often translated as illusion in Eastern philosophy, but here the Siddha Vedam frames it as this incredibly active, churning reality. It's the state of the void, Akasa, when it is entirely filled with the swirling motion of Vayu. Without that motion, you just have a silent void. With it, you have an ocean of experience, creation, and existence.
Mapping this analogy even further, let's look at the surface of this ocean. When physical water churns and crashes, what happens? It gathers into foam on the surface. The text explains that the exact same thing happens in the spiritual realm.
The constant motion and churning of Vayu in the ocean of Maya gathers together. And that condensed, churning spiritual foam is exactly what we call the mind. Your mind, my mind, it's all just the active, frothy surface of a much deeper, moving spiritual ocean.
Which brings us to Section 4, the ego bubble.
We've gone from the macro scale all the way down to the foam of the mind, so let's zoom straight in to a single, fragile manifestation right on that surface. If the mind is the foam, what sits on top of it? Bubbles. Those small, crystal-like shining domes floating right on top of the physical sea foam represent the spiritual concept of ahamkara, which translates to the ego, or our sense of individual I-ness. Our ego is literally just a bubble floating on the foam of the mind.
This definition is absolutely vital for understanding this entire philosophy. Ahamkara, your ego, your distinct sense of being an individual separated from the rest of the universe, is just a temporary hollow shape. It is formed entirely of the underlying source, the Vayu, the Jiva Shakti. It's made of the ocean, it rests on the ocean, but because it has this distinct shape for a brief moment, we think it's something entirely independent.
This breaks down the rather tragic yet completely recognizable life cycle of our ego, our ahamkara. First, it floats briefly on the air of the living force. Second, and I absolutely love this detail from the text, it contents itself with its own surface reflection. Think about that. The ego bubble is just looking at the shiny reflection on its own curved surface, completely ignoring the vast, deep ocean it's sitting on. Third, because it's so distracted by itself, it becomes completely deluded about its own stability. It actually thinks it's a permanent fixture. And finally, the inevitable truth. It bursts in no time at all.
What you should fundamentally take away from this is the reality of the pop. When a bubble on the ocean bursts, where does the air inside it go? Where does the water that formed its shell go? It doesn't disappear. It just instantly returns to the unified moving source it came from. It loses its temporary identity, its temporary shape, and merges back with the value. The boundaries of the ego were an illusion all along.
So, we've now brought this explainer full circle. Looking again at the teacher's initial lesson, we have a completely new visual understanding. One and the same thing assumes different forms, and it is on account of these different forms that different names are found to exist. Water, wave, foam, bubble. Akasa, Vayu, mind, ego. It is all the exact same substance. We just get utterly confused because we invent a new word every single time the unified ocean takes on a temporary new shape.
I want to leave you with this provocative thought to ponder today. We spend so much of our lives polishing the surface of our little ego bubble, admiring our reflection, entirely deluded about our own stability in the universe. But if the Siddha Vedam is right, and you are just a temporary shape made of the ocean itself, when your own fragile bubble of ahamkara eventually pops and merges back into the vast ocean of Maya, who are you, really? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. See you next time.